a casual hoodie, a high-end showroom, and an unexpected revelation. This is what unfolds when a dealership manager misjudges the man who actually owns it all. Darryl pulled into the parking lot of Prestige Motors, the flagship dealership he had recently acquired in sunny Scottsdale, Arizona. The desert heat shimmered against the polished luxury cars displayed out front, their sleek surfaces glowing under the afternoon sun. He parked his unassuming SUV in an unmarked spot toward the back, then stepped out, pausing for a moment to take in the dealership's facade. His outfit was anything but flashy, an intentional choice. A simple gray hoodie, slightly worn, paired with jeans and sneakers, was his attire for the day. Dressing casually was a strategic decision. He wanted to see the dealership as it truly operated, observing how the staff interacted when they had no idea the new owner was watching. As he approached the entrance, he noticed a small group of employees gathered near the front desk, engaged in light conversation and laughter. Their voices carried through the glass doors, but as soon as Darryl stepped inside, the lively chatter began to die down. The contrast between the scorching heat outside and the crisp, air-conditioned showroom was stark. The scent of leather and fresh wax filled the space, and rows of pristine cars gleamed under the bright overhead lights. He felt the subtle shift in energy as employees exchanged quick glances, their eyes flicking toward his hoodie and sneakers. The change in atmosphere was almost imperceptible, yet it spoke volumes. Still, Darryl wasn't there to jump to conclusions. He was there to observe. Then from across the showroom she appeared, Susan. A middle-aged woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, she carried herself with authority. Her tailored blazer, polished heels, and the clipboard, tucked under her arm, all signaled efficiency and experience. She strode toward him with purpose, her heels clicking against the showroom floor. At first, her expression was polite, but Darryl didn't miss the tightness in her smile. "Excuse me," she said coolly, her tone clipped. "Can I help you with something?" Darryl returned her gaze with a calm smile. "Just looking around," he replied casually, motioning toward the cars. Susan's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in his appearance, her polite facade slipping just a fraction to reveal something less welcoming. "Are you shopping for a car?" she asked, her tone carrying an unmistakable note of doubt. Darryl nodded, still smiling. "Something like that." Susan pressed her lips together. "Well, we cater to a very specific clientele here. Most of our vehicles require pre-qualification. Perhaps I could recommend—" Before she could finish, another employee called out, "Hey, Susan, the delivery guy is here." For a split second, her focus wavered, but her gaze snapped right back to Darryl, as if making sure he didn't wander too far. Darryl raised an eyebrow, but kept his tone neutral. "You're assuming I'm not qualified?" For a brief moment, she seemed caught off guard, but she recovered quickly, her posture straightening. "I'm just trying to save you some time," she replied with a forced smile. "These vehicles start at 6 figures. Maybe I can direct you to—" Darryl's expression remained unchanged, though he silently took note of her choice of words. He remained composed, but there was no denying the sting of her assumptions. The moment hung in the air, the tension palpable as Susan waited for his response. Instead, Darryl shifted his attention to a nearby vehicle, a sleek silver coupe with an aggressive design. Running his fingers lightly over the door handle, he glanced back at Susan. "Nice car," he remarked simply. Her brows furrowed slightly, but she forced another tight smile. "It is. Perhaps when you're ready to make a serious inquiry, we can set up an appointment. For now, I'll have to ask you not to touch the vehicles." Darryl held her gaze for a moment, considering her words. Then he casually stepped back from the car, hands in his pockets, and gave her a small nod. "Go on," he gestured, inviting her to continue. "All right, let's hear it. What would you recommend for someone like me?" Susan blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his directness. Before she could respond, Darrell continued, "If you think you know what I need, I'm all ears." His polite demeanor cracked just enough to reveal a hint of impatience. "Perhaps something more budget-friendly," she replied after a beat. "I can give you directions to a dealership that specializes in pre-owned vehicles." Darrell's faint smile didn't reach his eyes. He had seen enough. "That's quite the assumption," he said softly. The words lingered in the air, and for a brief moment Susan hesitated. Then, regaining her composure, she squared her shoulders. "I'll be back with a list of options," she said, briskly, before turning and walking away. Darrell watched her go, his expression unreadable. He turned back toward the silver coupe, his reflection staring back at him in the glossy finish. This was going to be an interesting day. Standing in the center of the showroom, hands in his pockets, he let his gaze drift over the lineup of cars. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but Susan's dismissive attitude was hard to ignore. Around him, the staff had resumed their conversations, though he caught the occasional glance in his direction. It was a familiar kind of scrutiny, the quiet judgment, the fleeting yet telling looks. Susan returned moments later, clutching her clipboard as though it were a shield. Her purposeful stride and forced smile barely masked her irritation. "All right," she said, stopping a few feet from him. "I've compiled a few options that might be more suitable for your situation." Darrell tilted his head slightly. "My situation?" "Yes," Susan answered, her tone clipped as she handed him a printout. It listed pre-owned vehicles, each accompanied by a detailed description and a price tag, well below the dealership's usual range. "These are more accessible models, reliable, economical, and, well, practical." Darrell took the list without comment, scanning the page. A used sedan, an older SUV, a compact hybrid. His lips twitched in faint amusement, though he quickly masked it, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. "Appreciate the effort," he said evenly. For a moment Susan seemed thrown by his response, but she quickly recovered, resting her hands on her hips. "Listen," she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "I'm just trying to be realistic with you. Prestige Motors isn't for everyone. I don't want to waste your time." Darrell met her gaze, his expression calm yet unwavering. "And what exactly makes you think I'm not your target customer?" Susan hesitated, but only briefly. "I've been doing this a long time," she said. "I can tell when someone's out of their depth." "Out of their depth," Darrell repeated, his voice neutral, almost reflective. "Interesting." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Susan's face, but she pressed on. "I'm just being honest. It's better to be upfront than to have someone leave disappointed." Darrell let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Honest, huh? I like honesty. How about this? You let me speak to the owner. Think we can make that happen?" For the first time, Susan looked genuinely taken aback. "The owner?" "That's right," Darrell said, his tone light, almost conversational. "I'd like to have a word with them." Susan's lips twitched in a strained attempt at a smile. "Well, that's not possible today. The owner doesn't just drop by for casual visits. They're a busy person." "I'm sure they are," Darrell said with a slight nod. "But maybe you could give them a call. Let them know I'm here. I have a feeling they'd want to meet me." Susan's smile tightened, her patience wearing thin. It was clear she was growing frustrated. "Look, sir, I'm trying to be as polite as possible, but this is getting ridiculous. I have other customers to attend to. If you're serious about buying a car, we can set up a meeting with one of our sales consultants. Otherwise—" "Otherwise what?" Darrell interrupted, his voice still composed but carrying a distinct edge. Susan's eyes narrowed, her irritation breaking through. "Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Her words hung in the air, thick with implication. The showroom seemed to fall silent. Darrell held her gaze for a long moment, unmoving. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "All right," he said casually, scrolling through his contacts. "I'll just make the call, myself." Susan blinked, her brow creasing. "What are you doing?" "Calling the owner," Darrell replied, lifting the phone to his ear. "Shouldn't take long." For the first time, Susan's confidence wavered. Her irritation shifted to confusion. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Around them, several employees had stopped what they were doing, drawn in by the growing tension. Darrell held up a finger, signaling for a moment of patience, then turned slightly away as he spoke into the phone. "Yeah, it's me. I'm at the dealership. Everything's fine. Just a little misunderstanding. Could you let them know I'm here?" He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket before turning back to Susan. "They'll be here shortly," he said simply. Susan stared at him, her mouth slightly open. Who did you just call?" Darrell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in the curious eyes now fixed on him. "Guess we'll find out," he said, his tone almost playful. The weight in the room was unmistakable, pressing down on everyone. Susan shifted uneasily, her composure beginning to fray. Minutes passed, but time felt stretched. She busied herself with her clipboard, though her movements were rigid and deliberate, betraying her discomfort. Meanwhile, Darrell stood relaxed near a luxury SUV, his unshaken demeanor only adding to the tension. Scattered across the showroom, employees whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking between Darrell and Susan, waiting for something, for someone. Then, the front doors opened. A sharply dressed man in a navy suit stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tile. His expression was serious yet warm, and his eyes immediately locked onto Darrell. "Mr. Carter," the man greeted, with a broad smile, striding forward and extending a hand. "So good to see you." Darrell returned the handshake firmly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks for coming, Alex. Appreciate it." The entire room seemed to stiffen. Susan's clipboard nearly slipped from her grasp. Her eyes darted between Darrell and Alex, the dealership's regional director, her expression shifting from confusion to outright alarm. "Wait, Mr. Carter?" she echoed, uncertainty creeping into her voice. Alex turned to her, his friendly demeanor cooling into something more professional, almost clipped. "Susan? I see you've already met Mr. Carter." Susan blinked, her mouth opening and closing as if grasping for words. I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize he's the new owner of this dealership," Alex finished, his tone sharp. He glanced at Darrell, his expression tinged with apology. "I trust this wasn't your ideal welcome." Darrell raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "It's all right, Alex. I think Susan and I just got off on the wrong foot." His voice remained calm, but there was a weight to his words that made the entire room hold its breath. Susan's face paled, and she took a step back, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a lifeline. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Darrell tilted his head slightly. "Didn't know what?" His tone was still gentle, but there was an undeniable firmness to it. "That I could own a place like this? That someone like me might actually belong here?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked completely lost. "I didn't mean—" Darrell held up a hand, cutting her off. "It's fine, Susan. Really." He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that everyone instinctively leaned in. "But let me ask you something. If I weren't the owner, would you have treated me any differently? Would you have given me the same respect you give someone who walks in here wearing a suit and tie?" Susan opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening. Darrell nodded, as if her silence was all the answer he needed. Then, turning to Alex, his voice carried a new authority. "Let's gather everyone in the conference room. I think it's time we have a talk about how things are run around here." One by one, the employees made their way to the sleek conference room. Designed to impress with its glass walls and modern decor, today it felt stifling. Susan sat near the back, her usual confidence replaced by nervous stillness. Darrell stood at the head of the table, composed, his presence commanding attention. Alex positioned himself near the door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he watched the staff take their seats. A quiet murmur of whispers drifted through the room, but it died the moment Darrell cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping across the group. "Thank you all for joining me on such short notice," he began, his tone steady but firm. "For those of you who don't know, my name is Darrell Carter, and as of last month, I'm the new owner of Prestige Motors." A few employees murmured in surprise, their reactions ranging from curiosity to embarrassment. Susan sank lower into her chair, avoiding eye contact. "I came in today dressed casually for a reason," Darrell continued, his voice measured. "I wanted to see how this dealership operates when no one knows who I am. I wanted to experience what a potential customer might feel walking through these doors." He let the words settle before continuing. "What I experienced today was disappointing. I was judged, not for what I could bring to the table, but for how I looked." He paused, letting his gaze move across the room. "And I'm not here to single anyone out, but we need to talk about what that says about this dealership's culture." Susan shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face flushed. "This isn't just about me," Darrell went on. "It's about every person who walks through those doors. Every customer who doesn't fit into someone's preconceived notion of what a luxury car buyer looks like." One of the younger sales associates hesitantly raised his hand. Darrell gave him a nod. "Go ahead." "Mr. Carter," the man began nervously. The young sales associate shifted in his seat before speaking. "I think most of us try to treat customers fairly, but sometimes it's hard not to make assumptions." Darrell nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that," he said. "We all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. But here's the thing. It's not enough to just try to be fair. We have to actively challenge those biases. We have to create an environment where everyone feels respected, regardless of their appearance, background, or anything else." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room before continuing. "This dealership has built a reputation for excellence, but excellence isn't just about the cars we sell. It's about the experience we provide. And from now on, that experience is going to be built on respect, inclusivity, and fairness." A ripple of agreement moved through the room, though a few faces remained wary. Darrell's gaze eventually settled on Susan. She sat frozen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Susan," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind, "I want to give you the opportunity to speak. Is there anything you'd like to say?" All eyes turned to her. She hesitated, struggling for words, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. I made a mistake," she admitted, her cheeks flushing. "I misjudged you, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Darrell's face remained unreadable, but he gave a slow nod. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "I hope this experience serves as a reminder for all of us, not just you, because real change starts with accountability." He turned back to the group. "Moving forward, we'll be implementing new training programs to ensure this dealership reflects the values I believe in. Every customer deserves to be treated with dignity. No exceptions. If anyone has an issue with that, now's the time to speak up." Silence. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning. No one spoke, but the weight of Darrell's words lingered. He let the quiet stretch just long enough to make his point before speaking again, his voice calm but resolute. Good, he said. I'm glad to see we're all on the same page. Change isn't always easy, but it's necessary. And this dealership is going to lead by example. He stepped away from the table, resting his hands lightly on its edge as he leaned forward slightly. Let me be clear. I didn't come here today to humiliate anyone. I came to understand the culture I've inherited and how we can make it better. His eyes moved to Susan, who still sat quietly near the back. Susan, he continued, his tone softening just enough to show he wasn't attacking her. You're an experienced manager, and I know you've worked hard to get where you are, but today was a wake-up call for you and for all of us. Susan looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. I understand, she said, her voice shaky but sincere. I was wrong, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Darryl nodded. I believe in second chances, he said simply, but accountability comes first. I'll be meeting with you one-on-one to discuss next steps. For now, let's focus on moving forward. Straightening, he turned his attention back to the rest of the team. We're not just selling cars here, he said. We're building trust, creating relationships, and setting a standard of excellence. If you're on board with that, I'm here to support you every step of the way. This time, the murmur of agreement was louder, more genuine. The initial tension in the room seemed to ease, replaced by a sense of renewed purpose. Even Alex, who had been standing quietly by the door, gave an approving nod. Darryl allowed himself a faint smile, the kind that carried both relief and determination. All right then, let's get back to work. And remember, how we treat people matters more than anything we sell. As the employees began to file out of the room, Darryl caught Susan lingering by the door. Susan approached cautiously, her hands twisting nervously. Mr. Carter, she started, her voice soft, I just want to thank you for giving me the chance to do better. I won't let you down. Darryl studied her for a moment before responding, his voice steady. I hope you mean that, Susan. Words matter, but it's actions that speak the loudest. I believe people can change if they're willing to try. She nodded, her eyes sincere. I am. Darryl watched her leave, then turned to Alex. Let's schedule a meeting with the staff next week, he said. I want to make sure everyone knows what's expected moving forward. Alex smiled, his respect for Darryl clear. You got it, boss. As Darryl stepped back into the showroom, he glanced at the cars, their shiny surfaces reflecting the afternoon light. He thought about how much work was ahead, but for the first time that day, he felt hopeful. This wasn't just about running a dealership. It was about building something bigger, a place where people were judged by their character, not their appearance. And Darryl was ready to lead the way.